Thanks.
Oh,
Yeah, great to see everybody. So our speaker this week, someone near and dear to our hearts, Denis Walsh, talking on the normative perspective. Denis is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, an acronym I could never keep track of. And of course, he's one of our 8 research leads here at the Institute. Denis's current work is focused on the concept of natural agency and how our conceptions of agency and normativity fit into our understanding of the natural world, which will in turn shed light on the concept of artificial agency in AI. And he is, just stimulating so much great thought for us and for me in particular at the Institute. So Denis, with that, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jillian. So thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be a member of the SRI community. And so I hope to make a contribution to the wonderful broad-ranging discussions we have. So I will share my screen. How's that? Okay.
Looks good.
Looks good.
Okay, so, right, this is called a normative perspective. And the general idea is to try and investigate the nature of norms. And in particular, address the question whether or not norms can be considered to be part of the furniture of the natural world, and whether or not the normative might fall within the ambit of the natural sciences. Okay, so I think that's what we need to do by way of introduction. So if we're going to claim that norms are part of the furniture of the world, it can be the subject of natural sciences, we have a challenge to address. It's certainly the prevailing opinion in the philosophy of science that norms are not part of the natural world. And I'm not sure, but I think it's the prevailing opinion in other areas of philosophy that deal directly with the nature of norms. At least if it's not the prevailing opinion, the idea that norms are not real, not part of the natural world is a challenge to be overcome. So here's an example of a kind of anti-naturalism about norms. It dates back to G.E. Moore, his Principia Ethica and other places. And Moore gives us this, what he calls the open question argument. This is an argument designed to make us think that any attempt to naturalize norms is going to be bootless, right? It's going to be unsuccessful. So he says, suppose we have an analysis of the good in terms of some natural phenomenon N, like pleasure or something like that. And then we notice that X, some state of affairs, instantiates or promotes this natural phenomenon pleasure. So then Moore says it's always going to be an open question whether N, or this thing instantiating N, is good, whether or not this thing, this state of affairs that conduces to pleasure or promotes pleasure is in itself good. And the answer, and the question is, we will never be able to answer that question within the framework of our natural sciences. So here's our colleague Tom Herka telling us about Moore's open question argument. It says it has 2 main theses, 2 main presuppositions. One is a kind of realism about moral or the normative, that norms or oughts are objectively true or false, or at least normative judgments are true or false. They're about facts. And the other is the autonomy of ethics, which is the idea that moral judgments are sui generis. They can't be reduced to or derived from non-moral facts or statements, right? For example, the scientific or the metaphysical. They expressed a distinctive kind of objective truth. And seeing as they can never be reduced to natural judgments or natural properties, these good properties can never be reduced to natural properties, they must be non-natural. So one thing to notice about this is that this idea about naturalizing is an inherently reductive idea. To naturalize the good, we cash it out in terms of things that don't mention irreducibly normative properties. Okay, so that's an example of the kind of prevailing anti-naturalism about norms. And it has a great deal of intuitive motivation or appeal because norms just seem to be very different kinds of things from natural facts. So one feature of norms that people tend to concentrate on is that norms are inherently motivating, right? To feel the pull of an ought is to be disposed somehow to act in a way that this norm impels you to do so. So to apprehend that one ought to do X is eo ipso to be motivated to do X. That's one kind of putative feature of norms that is not a feature of natural facts. To understand a natural fact is not necessarily to be motivated to act in a particular way or to feel some compulsion. And natural facts then are non-normative. And the idea here is that the nature of an objective natural fact can be exhausted by some non-normative description. So maybe bodies in free fall accelerate towards the center of the earth at 91.81 meters per second squared. And we've exhausted that fact by describing it. We wouldn't say, and furthermore, they ought to do that. And nor would we say of an object that isn't accelerating at that rate, that they're free falling wrong. They're not doing anything wrong. So there are no normative judgments that apply to natural facts. So it looks like normative facts, whatever they are, norms, and natural facts are very different kinds of things, okay? So we have this kind of prevailing anti-naturalism about the normative to get over if we want to be normative naturalists. So I would like to make a case for normative naturalism, and I want to make the case that norms are a particular kind of fact. They are constitutively perspectival natural facts or phenomena. So their norms are constitutively perspectival and natural. And in order to make the claim credible, of course, we have to address the prevailing anti-naturalism. So I have to make an anti-normative anti-naturalism case. And my claim is that normative anti-naturalism commits a certain kind of error. I'll call it an error of perspective. So you'll notice that in each of these two claims, the concept of a perspective looms pretty significantly large. So I'm going to take my understanding of perspective from recent work in scientific perspectivism, in particular, these two wonderful resources, Ron Geary's very early expression of scientific perspectivism and a recent collection of essays by Michaela Massolini and Casey McCoy that are kind of a retrospective on scientific perspectivism over the last 15 years or so. Okay, so consider the scientist's predicament then. The world's really complex, and we have these limited cognitive resources, and somehow or other we have to bring the complexity of the world into alignment with the limited resources we have, right? And so we have to do something to reconcile the complexity of the world and the limits of our resources. Well, the way we engage with the world as scientists is it's mediated. Our engagement with the world is mediated. It's mediated by instruments. We use instruments to simplify and measure the salient features of the world. Most particularly, I'll concentrate on the notion of a model. We use models to engage with the scientific world. We also probably, there's a very strong connection here between the notion of a model and our perceptual apparatus. So a few weeks ago, Brian was talking to us about perceptual ontologies and how our perceptual ontologies can mediate between us and the complexity of the world. They pick out the regularities at the scale that are salient to our capacity to act. Okay, so I want to talk about models. So scientists represent the world through models, or they engage with the world through models. We build our theories out of models. Now, these models may be mathematical descriptions, they may be theoretical descriptions, they may be physical things that emulate the workings of some target phenomenon we want to understand about. And the standard analogy for a model is a map. In fact, it's not an analogy at all. A map is a model. A map is a model of the surface of the Earth. And the thing about a map is it's a simplified representation of the surface of the Earth, but it's also heavily distorted, right? So take the standard Mercator projection that's on my right there. That is a kind of projection of the 3D surface of the Earth that you might get from wrapping a cylinder around around a sphere and then projecting light from some point inside the sphere, and you get this image, right? Now, the Mercator projection is a distortion and a simplification, and it's a really good model. It's distorted for a very particular purpose. So Mercator wanted a map that navigators could use. And so all the lines of longitude and latitude intersect at right angles. And so any straight line on the Mercator projection is a line of true navigational trajectory, right? So if you want to get from one place to another place on the Mercator trajectory, you draw a straight line, and that is your direction of travel. It may not be the shortest distance, but it's a line of true trajectory. Here's another projection, the Nomic projection, and that distorts in a different way for different purposes. In the Nomic projection, straight lines are parts of great arcs. So the straight lines on the Nomic projection will be the shortest distance between 2 points on the sphere. Okay, so the idea of a map as a model tells us a lot about the nature of models. They're simplified and they're distorted, in ways that serve the purpose of the modeler. Okay, now because of this, because we engage with the world as mediated through our models, when as scientists, we take a perspective of the world, that's given to us by the model. And so Geary tells us that scientific practice then is ineluctably perspectival. He says, nevertheless, all theoretical claims remain perspectival in that they apply only to aspects of the world, and then in part because they apply only to some aspects of the world, never with complete precision. The result is an account of science that brings observation and theory, perception and conception closer together than they have seemed in objective accounts and objectivist accounts. This idea of the closeness of modeler's perspective to the idea of perception will become important as we go along. Okay. So models transform their targets. They're different from their targets. How do they transform them? Well, as we've seen, they simplify them and they distort them. And also, any target system like the spherical surface of the globe can be modeled from multiple perspectives, like the Mercator projection or the Nomic projection. So Misurita Chiramuta says, well, this induces a kind of scientific pluralism, right? We engage with the world through a plurality of perspectives. So she says, one way to understand the lesson of perspectivism is that the picture of the world offered by science is like a cubist painting. A handful of different points of view are employed at once, and reality comes through us only as fragmented and distorted. We have no access to a God's eye view of nature, and science is not a clear, accurate depiction of reality. Well, that's discouraging. Okay, so we got these so perspectivism in science induces pluralism in science, and we approach the world through different models, each of which is a perspective. And so one question we might ask is, what's the relation between distinctive perspectives on a single target system? And roughly speaking, the answer is opacity. They're opaque to one another. Now, this opacity between the perspectives we might take has a number of different degrees and a number of different sources, and the sources of opacity will be important as we go along. Okay, so here's an example of a degree of opacity between pluralistic models of a target system. There are two sorts of models or approaches to understanding protein structure. We use X-ray diffraction and nuclear magnetic resonance. And these are two perspectives on protein structure, and these two perspectives give us different kinds of information. X-ray diffraction gives us information about the location, density of electrons, and NMR gives us information about the relative spatial relations and the strength of the bonds between nuclei. Okay, so Sandra Mitchell says, in short, X-ray perspective detects electron cloud reflectance, while NMR detects nuclear magnetic changes. Each has a something or other perspective on the target phenomena. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of Corey here so I can read my slides. Anyway. X-ray experiments allow an inference to the relative positions of atoms, and NMR experiments inference the relative distance of atoms. Clearly, the scientific models of the phenomena are each partial and perspectival, and they generate different predictive representations by using different methods to interact with different target features. But the important feature of this kind of perspectivism is that the two perspectives can be integrated. Each of them is a simplification of a complex, takes a different feature of a complex relation, but we can kind of decontextualize these perspectives and integrate them and get a fuller picture of the structure of proteins. Okay, so these perspectives then are partially opaque, but they're reconcilable to one another. But typically, that's not the relation between perspectives or models. Most models of really complex target phenomena are non-integratable. So our wonderful former colleague, Margie Morrison, says, look at the way atomic nuclei are modeled. These atomic nuclei are modeled by using 30 different kinds of models, and these are radically different from one another. So she says some models assume that nucleons move approximately independently in the nucleus, while others characterize the nucleons as strongly coupled due to their strong short-range interactions. She goes on to say nuclear spin, size, binding energy, fission, and several other properties of stable nuclei are all accounted for using models that describe one and the same entity in different and contradictory ways, right? So these models are constructed in such a way that they introduce a distortion that's necessary for the working of the model itself. But as a consequence of that, the models can't be reconciled with one another. So if one of these models tells us the truth about nuclear, the structure of nuclei, and they're pairwise non-compatible with with one another, then 29 of these models are telling us a lie about the structure of nuclei. Okay, these models cannot be reconciled in the way that the protein models can be, and this is extremely widespread in the sciences, right? So Ron Geary tells us about the incompatibility of quantum models and general relativity models. Climate models, Wendy Parker says that complex climate models generally are physically incompatible with one another. They represent the physical processes acting in the climate system in mutually incompatible ways and produce different simulations of the climate, and they cannot be reconciled with one another. Okay, so different perspectives on the same target system are often irreconcilably opaque to one another. They can't be reconciled. The reasons are that different models have different ontologies. They carve up the world in different ways. Different models capture different phenomena or regularities, and they make different distortions. They make these distortions in order to capture the phenomena or the regularities. And these distortions are so different that they cannot be reconciled with one another. Okay. So then we have this kind of radical perspectival or interperspectival opacity in the natural sciences as we go on anyway. Okay, so we've got perspectivism and pluralism and the idea that perspectives tend to be opaque to one another. Okay, now here's a really interesting point, I think. When Geary introduces his concept of scientific perspectivism, he uses color vision as an illustrative example or an analogy, because he says color vision provides the best exemplar I know of the kind of perspectivism that characterizes modern sciences. And he's right in a certain way, because we really get an understanding of what it is to take a perspective by thinking about color. But there's another sense in which color perception gives us a concept of perspectivism that goes far, far beyond the standard scientific perspectivism. So Geary says, look, well, how is it that we see the world in colors? Well, we've got these three different types of sensors. We're trichromatic. So sensors that resonate to short wavelength light, to medium wavelength light, and long wavelength light. And normally in humans, they have this ratio of 1 to 5 to 10 to short, medium to long. Okay. And that, along with other features of our sensitivity, gives us this kind of objective color solid. This is a map of what our color phenomena are like, right? Now, what's really crucial here is the differences in activation level between these three different kinds of sensors. So the differences in activation level give us the differences in color and the relations between them. Okay, so for instance, when long wave is greater than the medium wave ones, where our colors are in the reddish in the reddish zone, and when the inequality is reversed, we've got greenish colors, and roughly similar things go for yellow and blue. So these things give us our kind of structure of the color wheel. And because our sensors are sensitive to different wavelengths of light in these proportions, in these ways, there are certain objective regularities in the world that are constituted by the fact that we detect colors in this way. So for instance, we have color constancy. Now, color doesn't map one-one onto any particular wavelength or intensity, but what happens when the background lighting conditions change, we tend to see the objects in our view as not changing color. And this has to do with not anything about the surface reflectance of these objects. It has to do with the relative proportions of the sensitivities of our three sensory types of cells, right? So there are regularities in the world, color constancy, that are a function of our particular sensory interaction with the world. And were it not for the fact that our color apparatus works in this way, there'd be no reason to suppose that those things we take to be the same color really fall into any kind of natural category or natural regularity. And the same goes with metamerisms. Different spectral inputs produce the same color percept. And were it not for the fact that we respond to these different spectral inputs in the same way, there'd be no reason to suppose that they constitute the same phenomenon, right? So Geary tells us that color perception is perspectival. He calls it a kind of interactionism. He says that colors are the product of an interaction between aspects of the environment and the evolved human visual system. Okay, so this perspectivism is really important, I think, and it's a different kind of perspectivism than we've encountered before. So I want to say that color is constitutively perspectival, which is to say that it's not merely picked out by like using a medium. What it is to be a color is it arises out of a particular perspective that an entity takes on the world. So color is constituted by this kind of interaction between a perceiver and the world. So the color and the color wheel and their color phenomena are perspective dependent. So for instance, birds and bees are not trichromats, they're tetrachromats. They have 4 kinds of receptive cells. So their color worlds are very, very different from ours. And we can emulate or simulate the way they might experience colors. We can't experience what they experience, but we can simulate the structure and the differences in their color worlds by noticing that they can perceive ultraviolet light. So we can measure ultraviolet light and we can see how they would perceive, say, the color structure of a flower, a Canasia flower, I think this is, compared to the way we see it, right? So colors are constitutively perspectival, and they're dependent on the particulars of the perspective. Nevertheless, colors are objective. There are objective discernible patterns that hold in the world on account of the fact that certain entities take certain perspective or perceptual perspectives on the world. Okay. So colors then are constitutively perspectival. They're constituted by entities taking a perspective on the world. They're perspective dependent, and their color experiences are not accessible to entities that can't take that perspective. So we can't experience what a bee experiences when they see an echinacea flower. Nevertheless, color facts are objective facts. They're intersubjective, they're subject to intersubjective non-collusive agreements. So for instance, there's the fact of the matter about the colors on the Ukrainian flag. It's blue on the top and it's yellow on the bottom. And if you were asked to hoist the Ukrainian flag and you hoisted it with the yellow on the top and the blue on the bottom, you'd have done something wrong. You may even cause an international incident, right? So color facts are objective facts and they make a difference in the world, right? So here we have this. So here we have this funny set of facts. They're constitutively perspectival. There certain features of them are accessible only from a perspective, and yet they figure in these objective regularities in the world. So here's Geary talking about colors in another paper. I slightly disagree with him here, but I think it's a pretty good summation. Geary says, I claim that colors are best thought of as neither completely objective nor purely subjective, neither as properties of either parts of the material world or subjective experience, but as a property of an interaction between the material world and the human observers. So I disagree with him in the sense that I think they're completely objective, but we can see what he's doing here. He's weighing off the idea that colors must somehow be subjective because they're not out there in the world. I think that they are wholly objective. Nevertheless, they are constitutively perspectival. Okay, so we have this notion then of a constitutively perspectival objective matter of fact. Okay, so here's a new category for us to conjure with: constitutively perspectival objective facts. They have perspectivity. These are facts that arise out of the capacity of certain entities to take a perspective. Were there no such entities in the world, there would be no such fact. And nevertheless, they're objective. There are objective color facts, for instance, in the world, and colors figure in objective regularities. So we have a special role for another role for perspectives to take. Our scientific perspectives that we've encountered so far just kind of, they don't make facts, they register facts or accentuate facts, or they make certain things salient. But these kinds of perspectives augment the world. They bring facts into existence in the world. So certain facts exist only because there are entities capable of taking a particular perspective on the world. And I take it this is one of the crucial differences between perceptive perspectives and mere scientific perspectives. Okay, so color facts are constitutively perspectival objective facts. So given that we've got these constitutively perspectival objective facts, we can ask two questions about them. We can ask, what is red perception like? And that's a question we can't answer unless we're able to adopt the constituting perspective. Okay. But there's another question we can ask. What difference does a red perception or red make to the world? And this we can access objectively without adopting the constituting perspective. So for instance, here's a fact about red. Red is very common in what's called aposematic coloration, right? When a highly poisonous animal like this granular frog here is really poisonous to eat, it behooves it to advertise the fact that it's just not worth eating. So red coloration seems to be a very common way of doing this in the animal world, right? So there are red facts, like aposematic coloration is predominantly red, right? And there are other facts that come from perceptions. So bees' behavior is explained by the way they perceive the colors of the world. The behavior of the drivers is explicable in this way. Drivers tend to stop at red lights and to go at green lights. So they're color regularities that are objectively accessible features of the world that are held in place by the fact that certain things are capable of taking a perspective. Okay, so we looked at the sources of opacity between different models or perspectives. So one source of opacity is they might make different kinds of simplifications. And this is what was going on in the protein structure case. And in those cases, those perspectives can be integrated by, as it were, decontextualizing the models, realizing that each of these things is just a partial representation of a complex objective reality. And we can sum these information from these two perspectives and get an integrated whole. Some other source of opacity comes from the fact that models or perspectives distort. And sometimes these distortions make for integratable models, but mostly they don't. Most models or scientific models of complex phenomena, as I said, cannot be integrated or cannot be reconciled with one another. But now we have another source of opacity of different perspectives, because certain perspectives are augmentative. Certain perspectives create new natural facts, like colors, right? And they're deeply opaque because certain of these features of these facts can be accessible only from a perspective by adopting that perspective. And so if you can't adopt this perspective, you can't integrate that perspective with your own perspective. Nevertheless, these facts are objective facts, and they inaugurate new objective regularities like color constancy or the behavior of drivers or bees or aposematic coloration, things like this. Okay. So then here we have this different source of opacity that holds between respective perspectives. And I think that if we have this kind of opacity, then we're subject to a kind of error of perspective. So what I'm doing here is kind of drawing from William James's notion of a vicious abstraction. In the Principles of Psychology, James says, well, here's how we meet up with the world. We just get this booming, buzzing confusion, and we abstract certain features from it. And we notice that these are like other features. And so we put them together, and then we make the mistake of thinking that these abstractions are what's really, really real, right? Or Erasmus Winter, in his recent book, calls this idea pernicious reification. So there the idea is certain of our scientific models, for instance, require these precepts, and they're there just for the internal workings of the models. But we very often make this mistake of taking those features of the model as being real, as reifying them, as being descriptions of the real world. My particular bugbear is in population genetics. That's a theory, a set of models that's defined over gene types, and gene types are abstract entities, right? But if we take our population genetics models too seriously, we end up thinking that biological reality is made up of the dynamics and the interaction between these gene types. That's a kind of what Erasmus would call a pernicious reification. We often use limit assumptions in our models, right? So in the population genetics models, we assume infinite population sizes or infinite populations of gene sizes. And we'd be making this mistake of pernicious reification if we thought that, oh, population genetics tells us that populations are infinitely large. No, the limit assumption is there because these models are fundamentally statistical, and the limit assumptions allow us to apply the statistics and to make some inferences using laws of large numbers and things like that. They're strictly internal to the working of the model. We make a mistake by exporting them out of the context of the model. Okay, so what I want to introduce then is a different kind of error perspective. I'll call it naive parochialism. So naive because I want to get away from this opprobrious language of vicious and pernicious, and parochialism because it's the idea of taking a perspective to exhaust what's real. So naive parochialism is taking what is accessible from a perspective to be exhaustive of reality. Okay, so then I think we have, with the idea of constitutively perspectival fact and the idea of naive parochialism, a particular kind of perspective error, we have the resources we need to argue that norms are natural and that normative anti-naturalism commits a particular kind of error. So the claim then is that norms are natural. They're constitutively perspectival facts, kind of like colors. And the normative anti-naturalism commits an error of perspective, in particular, naive parochialism. So those of you who are my SRI colleagues, you can take a little snooze now because you know what's coming. So the idea here is that there are agents in the world, organisms, rational agents, and agency, I take it, is an ecological phenomenon. It's a gross dynamical property of a system embedded in its setting. And in order to make sense of agency, we need three concepts. We need the concept of a goal. Agents pursue goals. And what's a goal? Well, it's a state of affairs that a system actively attains or maintains by marshalling elements of its repertoire in response to its affordances. Well, what's a repertoire? Well, a repertoire is a set of behaviors, an element of which a system can actuate in pursuit of its goals in response to its affordances. Oh, but what's an affordance? Well, an affordance is an impediment to, affordances are impediments to or opportunities for the pursuit of an agent's goals, given its circumstances and also given its repertoire. So these three concepts make a tight conceptual circle. Goal, repertoire, and affordance are defined in terms of one another. Okay. The central notion here is the notion of affordance that we get from J.J. Gibson's ecological theory of visual perception. So Gibson says the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes for good or ill. I mean it by something that refers to both the environment and the animal. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. So remember Geary saying that colors were part of an interaction between a perceiver and the world. So affordances are like that too. They take place at the interface or the contact of an agent and the world. And affordances are constitutively perspectival facts. They're facts, they're objective facts, but they arise from the capacity of certain entities, agents, to experience their circumstances from a particular point of view. They experience their circumstances as requiring a certain action, or as conducing to a certain outcome, or as an impediment to a certain outcome. But in order to experience one's conditions that way, one has to have goals and a propensity to pursue one's goals and respond to the conditions as appropriate or inappropriate to the pursuit of one's goals. Nevertheless, affordances are objective. There are lots of cool things that we can say about things in virtue of their affordances, right? So water affords drinking to this primate, and it affords swimming to this cetacean, and it affords locomotion to this water strider. Same thing, different affordances. They're different affordances because these things have different goals, different capacities, and they experience their settings, the water, as conducive to or being made available for the pursuit of different activities. Okay. So affordances are these perspectival interface kinds of things. Okay. Now, once we've got agency and affordances, we have a new set of facts and new features of the world and new concepts that we have to deploy to account for these. What am I doing here? So we get a new ontology on account of having agency, just like we have a new ontology on account of having color perception. We've got like red and color constancy and things like that. So there are phenomena and corresponding concepts that we require for describing agency, but they have no place in the absence of agents. There are, say, goals, and there are purposes, and there are means and ends, and there are, for instance, like functions. So Michael Thompson tells us that you take these life functions that we take to be like really basic to living things like metabolism or reproduction or foraging or digestion. And these have this character like color constancy. If we look at, say, the biochemistry of metabolism or foraging and digestion across the range of living things, there'd be no reason to think that these were processes of the same kind. Nevertheless, given these life form or life function concepts we have, like digestion, we can assemble all these different biochemical activities or processes under the banner of the same kind of activity, right? But that's because we have this ontology that is made available by the presence of agents in the world. And because we have this new ontology and new things to explain, we have a new scientific methodology. So there are methods or modes of explanation or descriptions that apply necessarily to agents or indispensable to agents, but are inapplicable to non-agential systems. So for instance, we have a mode of explanation, teleology. We can explain what something's doing by citing its goals, right? So why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side, right? So we explain this, this activity by citing the goals. Now, where there are goals and there are means towards the goals, there's a special relationship between the goals and the means that doesn't hold in non-agential systems. So goals hypothetically necessitate their means, as Aristotle would say, which is to say, given that a system has a goal and given its current conditions, there are things it has to do in order to fulfill the goal, and things it mustn't do in order to fulfill this goal. And because of that, we have this other relation, which is kind of the obverse of hypothetical necessity, which is conducing. So just as goals hypothetically necessitate their means conduce to the achievement of their ends. So we can understand the relationship between means and ends in a new way in terms of the concepts of hypothetical, the relations of hypothetical necessity and the relation of conducing. Now, these concepts, so these phenomena are fundamentally normative, right? So because there are agents, there are irreducibly normative phenomena, facts and relations, right? So for instance, because organisms have goals, we can assess what they do as appropriate to the fulfillment of the goal, right? So the chicken crossed the road, well, that was appropriate given its goal of getting to the other side. But certain activities of an agent may be inappropriate to those goals. But appropriateness is a fundamentally normative notion. Likewise, actions have success conditions. They're successful insofar as they conduce to or fulfill goals. And moreover, having goals and means is fundamentally motivating. This is the idea of an affordance. Affordances are motivating. So to experience an affordance is to experience in the world in such a way as it disposes one to act in ways that are conducive to the fulfillment of one's goals. So because there are agents, we have a new ontology, we have new objective regularities, and we have fundamentally normative features of the world, right? Now, the thing about this normativity is that if we try to reduce out these normative concepts of appropriateness, conduciveness, and success in non-normative terms, we lose their normative character. So this is something that Moore was pointing out to us, right? It's always an open question when we replace a normative concept with a non-normative concept, whether the non-normative concept captures what's normative about the normative phenomena. So it looks like we can't give a non-reductive, non-normative count of these natural norms. Nevertheless, they're natural norms. Okay, so norms, just like colors, seem to be these constitutively perspectival natural facts. They're natural phenomena. They arise out of the capacities of certain natural entities, which is the capacities they have to pursue goals. And the capacity they have to pursue goals depends on a capacity to take a certain perspective on the world, to see the world as affording activities, actions. So because of this, the agency inaugurates new constitutively perspectival facts, affordances, and these are normative. So affordances are inherently normative and motivating. Nevertheless, they're indispensable because we can't explain, say, the distinctive different behaviors of all these organisms' responses to water until we understand what the water affords them. Where are we now? Okay, so they're indispensable because they induce new objectively observable facts or regularities that would not exist in their absence. Okay, so I think that we've got what we need now here. We've got this idea that norms, like colors, are natural facts, but they're constitutively perspectival facts. You can't experience a norm unless you're capable of taking the perspective out of which the norm arises. Nevertheless, we have non-perspectival objective access to the difference that norms make in the world. Okay. So now we can also address this question of normative anti-naturalism. So we saw Moore's open question argument that says, look, if you've got this non-normative reduction of norms, the good is pleasure, and you notice that something is pleasurable, there's always going to be an open question whether it's good. And therefore, the conclusion is that the good is a non-natural phenomenon. Right? So my claim is that part of the open question argument is right. You can't capture the good from some non-normative notion, from, say, pleasure or anything like that. But the conclusion doesn't follow. Right? The conclusion, it seems to me, that norms or goods are non-natural phenomena seems to commit this perspectival error, this naive parochialism. It takes what we can see from a particular perspective, the perspective of, say, the natural sciences as we usually conceive them, as exhaustive of all of reality. But there's a feature of reality, the normativity, that is real and natural, but isn't accessible from that perspective. So the open question argument commits this naive parochialism by conflating the objective access to normative phenomena. For example, happiness corresponds nicely with the good, with the constitutively perspectival phenomena itself, the norm or the good. I didn't go into the causal closure argument, but that's, there's another argument from naturalism, from causal closure, and it misconstrues the causal perspective that we take on the world with the entire structure of reality. Okay, so there we are. So what we've got then is that normative naturalism should take this notion of a perspective very, very seriously. Normative facts are natural facts, and they arise out of the capacity of certain entities, agents, to take a perspective on their world. These normative perspectival facts can't be experienced. Oh, did I miss something? Yeah, I missed something about the black and white room. Okay, no worries. These normative facts can't be experienced unless one is capable of taking that perspective. Nevertheless, they make an objective difference to the world. There are regularities in the world that are objectively accessible that arise out of the fact that there are normative perspectives in the world. Okay. And I think, and then normative anti-naturalism makes this mistake of taking what we can see from the non-normative perspective and conflating that with all of the natural world of all of reality. So my claim is we should be normative, we should be naturalists about the normative, but in order to be naturalists about the normative, we have to take a certain kind of perspectivalism with respect to our engagement with the world. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Paul Patton for help with this, discussing these issues on perspectivalism. And I also want to acknowledge that the University of Toronto operates on traditional lands of the First Nations people. So thank you very much. And here are some sources.
Thank you, Dennis. That was terrific. I love this stuff. Let's see. We'll stop the share so we can.
Okay.
There we go. So we
Share.
can see. We've got it. We've got it. All good. All good. That's great. I'll go to Benjamin first for a question.
Yeah, thanks. I love this stuff. It's been a while since I've thought about it. This was really great. I'm wondering, so, you know, when we compare, like you're talking about the normative, right? But when we go to the specifically ethical, we worry about this kind of secondary quality approach, right? Where we analogize it to colors, you know, because I'm colorblind, red-green colorblind. So the world I see of colors is not the same one that most people see, but there's a sense in which I'm not making a mistake, right? It's inconvenient, especially when I'm painting, because, you know, other people aren't gonna get the effect that I'm getting. But, you know, from this perspectival perspective, like, well, you know, it's no more my mistake than the bee is making a mistake by not seeing what you and I see, I would think.
Yeah.
Then that seems problematic, right? So maybe most of us have the right set of responses, but some of us don't, right? And then we wouldn't be able to say that they're making any kind of mistake when they treat people in these different, in the ways that we consider ethically unacceptable.
Yeah, that's, no, that's exactly right. And I mean, this is like a, I think this is where the normative and the color phenomena are disanalogous, right? So like these color facts that I was talking about, like the Ukrainian flag is blue on the top and yellow on the bottom. They're objective facts, but they're sort of indexed to normal perceivers. And of course, there are tetrachromate humans, and there are dichromate humans, and then there are colorblind people, and we have different ranges of colors that are available to us. So these kind of objective facts are kind of indexed to a certain normal way of being, right? And that's exactly right. So that doesn't make it the case that there are color facts for me and color facts for you, and there are different ranges of facts. Why? Because the color facts for you are indexed to normal perceivers, right? But then, so you're not kind of biologically culpable for not being able to distinguish the berries from the leaves, as it were. But one wants to say in the ethical case that one is morally culpable, right, for not responding in the appropriate way. So that's right, and that's a disanalogy, and that's like the solution to that problem is for ethics, right? It's not for I mean, I'm kicking this into touch, but it's not for a kind of generalized conception of the nature of normativity. But I totally get that this is a challenge that any approach like this has got to face.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So I want to follow up on that directly, because I'm not sure you have to kick the can down the road, as opposed to making your model more aggressive to take on and incorporate what Benjamin says. So like Benjamin, I had the feeling like, oh, I'm liking this as a model of normativity in the animal kingdom, but I'm not so sure it captures the species' unique characteristics of human normativity. And what's making me uncomfortable is the idea of good or ill that's buried into that notion of affordances, which I can see for biological creatures could have to do with things like reproductive fitness and so on. And I'm just kind of thinking, yeah, but for human beings, our good and ill is not given to us by our evolutionary inheritance, not directly. We are at liberty to create value and decide what to do in a way that raccoons are not. And I'm thinking something that you gave, but I'm very friendly to the idea of the constitutively perspectival character of normativity. And I noticed when you were describing, so for me, the issue is, how do we get a notion of good or ill that's not that biological imperative notion?
Yes.
And for me, when you were talking about remedies for opacity, you said, well, what we're trying to do is, with the different styles of microscopy or whatever, is we're trying to sum information from multiple perspectives to get an integrated whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we are trying to do as agents is recognize the fact that we are in a multi-agent system, and we are trying to sum information from multiple perspectives to get an integrated whole. That integrated whole is known as, here it may become evident that I'm married to a Kantian. That integrated whole is known as the good. So we're trying to adhere to the categorical imperative. So when we're in this multi-agent system, and we recognize, one of the factors that we deal with is recognizing the agency of other people. And so the question, what is to be done, if that has a true answer, it better be an answer that's compatible with the exercise of everybody's agency. And so ideally it should be the same answer for everybody, just as the answer to the question, what is the case, should be an answer that integrates from both styles of microscopy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's like, it's kicking the can down the road, but not that far down the road, it turns out. I mean, we have to, so like, there's nothing kind of about swimming or maybe landing on a flower that requires coordination, fundamentally requires the coordination with other agents. But when we take it that it's, say, our nature to be political animals, to be, fundamentally, like one of our objectives is coordination, right? Then you might imagine that like some set of norms would apply uniformly to us, that's grounded in our capacity to integrate or coordinate, things like that. Yeah.
And if I can just take it back for a second in a Schwartz Reisman direction, like one thing you could think of us as doing is we engage in a form of supervised learning with each other.
Yeah.
But we're actually co-supervisors of the problem, what is to be done. And I'm going to give you an error signal if you are out of line normatively with this goal of coordinating our agency in a way that's going to be compatible.
Yeah, well, that's right. So, our normative landscape is extremely rich, and it involves other agents in a way that the normative landscape of a solitary dolphin swimming, or the affordance landscape of a solitary dolphin swimming doesn't. I think that's really an appealing idea. And I believe from Benjamin's talk that, that there's something to be said about reasoning in the same way. Like it's kind of fundamentally about coordination and interaction of agents and the commonality between agents. I think that's exactly right. And that's the way to enrich this notion. But there again, that's a kind of species specific conception of what the normative consists in, right? I mean, it's normative, but it's normative given our peculiar way of life as Homo sapiens. Is that going to be I mean, I think that's a really helpful suggestion, and I think that's the way forward.
It might be any species capable of this kind of mutual recognition of agency.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, super.
I just want to jump in here, and then I'll come to Brian, because I was going to say, so for humans, a central goal and defining goal is maintaining membership in a group. And I think I think so much comes from that, because then that normative structure for humans is, if I ignore the signals that Jennifer is talking about, for example, then I may get kicked out of the group. And what, humans have constructed these affordances that facilitate the capacity for the group to then actually, so you get this, and then what are humans? Humans have this phenomenal capacity for group coordination, and that makes like central goal is I got to maintain membership in this group. So if everybody's claps twice before they eat, and they I'm at risk of being thrown out if I don't, then that so I actually think there's a short distance to thinking about how this then connects back to what we then have lots of structure around, which is that moral reasoning, what is the good, and so on. Without being reductionist to say it's just consequential of what promotes a group coordination. It's actually an intellectual framework that we share, and is that affordance that, anyway, so I think there's a short road there.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. So, I mean, if I understand the connection between this and your work, then it's like the very responsiveness we have to the to our normative landscapes, if we can say it that, like the silly norms. These have really significant objective consequences, right? The cohesion of groups, or the solidarity amongst groups, or the size of groups, or things like that, right? So like, and really insignificant part of the explanation of our natural history is the fact that we're responsive to these norms in this way, right? So those norms then have got the normative character of the norms is explanatory, indispensable to the count of our sociality as persons, as something like that.
And there's even the sense in which, so just thinking about the idea that these are norms are facts, they create regularities and objective, and to say that in fact that's, I mean, the amazing thing about humans is we actually do treat things like one does not eat with one's feet or something as it's not very productive, but that we treat that as a fact. But then we also, right, so people around us respond even very viscerally to the violation of certain norms. But we also know that group can shift to a different framework that says feet was a bad choice. One doesn't eat with one's left hand, right? But we can shift to an environment that says, oh no, left hand is just fine. But we actually have these phases, these equilibria, in which people definitely responding to that, like that's a fact that one doesn't do that. Anyway, that was very so intriguing.
My claim is they are facts.
Yeah, right.
Facts and facts that change over time or change over context, but they're facts.
Yeah, great. Brian, thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was so careful to mute, it took me a while to figure out how not to. Thanks for a lovely talk, Dennis. I'm a big supporter of the constitutive perspectivalism and so on and so forth. I do think something relevant to AI is that we humans do know the difference between the world and our perspectives on it. And I think it's really important that we have a non-perspectival sense of the world in order to know that perspectives in fact clash and so on and so forth. But that's not my question, actually. My question is about goals. I can see how it is that you can get a norm to be a constitutive, perspectival, natural fact if agents have goals. But I've always been suspicious of goals. I confess, I just have a deep suspicion of it. I mean, it's probably because of my Calvinist upbringing or something. The problem is that things like being selfless or being honorable or being kind or being curious and so on and so forth, it seems to me one makes a mockery of those notions if one tries to make them into goals. Certainly if somebody does something selfless and you say, well, look, you wanted to, or that was your goal or something like that, that somehow profoundly misses what generosity and selflessness and so on and so forth are. Now, one possible answer is to go maybe not Jennifer's route, but the route that we talked about in a conversation with Jennifer about maybe goals of the group or something like that. But I confess I'm very unquiet about making generosity and so on and so forth into goals of the group. It reminds me a little bit of people who try to define representation as something that leads to appropriate action. And my sense is no, representation is something the world supports such that evolution discovered that if we represent, provides such that evolution was able to discover, as it were, representation as a way of, in fact, operating well. And if you just define representation in terms of its consequence, you actually miss what is the case about representation. And so similarly, I worry about turning selflessness, honor, kindness, generosity, curiosity, and so on and so forth into goals of groups. It seems to me that everything that matters about them is lost. Just to put it value neutrally.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I have a really hard time seeing the courage, valor as a goal, right? I mean, you could adopt it as a goal, right, but it wouldn't follow that you were acting courageously in doing so, right? And but like these are kinds of well, my inclination is to say they're dispositions, but then there's this whole literature on that can't be solved. But they're just kind of like, they're features that characterize one's interaction with the world over a broad range of contexts, over a broad range of circumstances. So, for instance, the way one approaches a particular goal might betoken a valoristic or courageous character, right? So, these are kind of, further sets of constraints on the way that we pursue our goals, but not goals themselves, or ways of, this sounds anti-realistic, but ways of characterizing a distinctive approach to the pursuit of one's goals, right? Or, but so I see them as something like that.
Right, that seems great. The only problem is that I would say the selflessness or the valor or the courage or something, I would think of those as the fundamental norms, not the goal. So I'm happy with that separation.
Yeah.
But then I would put ethics and normativity and so on and so forth onto those ways.
Yeah.
Not onto the goals.
Yeah. So the traditional virtues, not the Aristotelian virtues, those are the goals of ethical conduct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Does that go in the opposite? You cut out a bit when you're talking about representation, or I did. But does that go in the opposite direction of your account of representation? Because I think of representation as just kind of not like this causal intermediary between a state and an action. It's just like the fact that the fact that this squirrel goes after these nuts constitutes a representation. The representation doesn't mediate; it just is this, this feature of this kind of goal-directed activity. And then, like, courage and valor might be a feature of this particular approach to the pursuit of one's goals. That's like the wrong way around for you, I realize, but.
Yeah, I have my standard response, which is I need to buy you a pint. So I should shut up and let others talk, but we've got to talk about that.
Okay.
Oh, we all have to get together for a pint soon. We do. Lama.
Hi, thanks, Dennis, for a great talk. So in your framework of agency, where does intent fit? Like, for example, intent, like in setting the goal, for example, and
that's a really good question. So, for the most part, I deal with entry-level agency, the kinds of things that slime molds and protists have. That's the initial stage, and it doesn't enhance our understanding of slime mold behavior to say that they have certain intentions, right? They just do these things. They have certain goals, right? But I guess the notion of intention comes in when we're dealing with more complex agents. So really complex agents have complex repertoires. Because of that, they have really complex affordances, and they have a variety of goals, not all of which can be pursued at the same time. And so we have to choose between our goals or prioritize our goals. And so once we take on a goal as that which is worth pursuing, in contradistinction to any of the other goals, once we have this kind of rich repertoire and this rich landscape of goals, then the notion of intention gets some kind of bite, right? You intend to do that which you prioritize as a goal over and above your other standing goals. So I think there's a way of like ramping this up into the notion of an intention and even a belief. A taking is, we can think of belief as playing this role in the choosing between the multifarious goals and the affordances that we might have. So something like that. So intention belongs to a class of really complex agents. That's the very short, unsatisfactory answer. Did I even address the question? I may not have.
Yes, thank you, yeah. Yeah, I mean, normally these discussions will drag into free will and consciousness and whatever. So it's good it didn't go there. So thank
Don't
you.
go there because then you'll have to buy Brian a pint.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I, Dennis? So I was very struck your emphasis on you can't experience a norm if you're not able to take the perspective of the agents. And maybe I've ended that sentence the wrong way, I'm not sure. Anyway, you can't experience the norm if you're not able to take that perspective. So that has me now thinking about artificial agents.
Yes.
And so if we treat norms, and I think I'm understanding this, if we treat norms as, I mean, in one sense, I sort of want to say, look, they're not facts in the environment the way I probably would have said color is before this talk.
But they are.
But they are. And we do know that we can build machines to very accurately respond to color in the environment in ways that are communicable and make sense to humans, right?
Yeah.
We've been able to build those machines, and often building them just, through a neural network that just says, okay, just keep trying something, and when you finally get it right and label it the way we would label it, or label the flag correctly the way humans would label it, then we will treat that as. So now I'm trying to think about norms, because I'm very struck by this. So if we're trying to build artificial agents that are capable of participating in our normative environment, our normative landscape, what would it mean for them to take the perspective, to share our perspective? Or do they have to? How's that?
Right. That's a really, really difficult question. So I understand that there's this literature that I don't know about about agency and AI and responsibility and when is an AI a moral agent, things like this. So, and this, of course, it is one of the applications of this approach to agency. So I don't actually know what kinds of things get to be agents. So there's a view around that I think is a kind of plausible view that in order to be an agent, you have to have cytoplasm, right? Because, I wasn't going to say meat, because plants are agents and, paramecia are agents. You have to have cytoplasm. Why? Because what it is to be an agent on this view is to be this kind of self-organizing, self-synthesizing thing that constructs the conditions that are necessary for its own persistence, right? So agency arises out of that. Now, the account I gave of agency didn't say anything about self-building, self-synthesizing. It took agency to be an ecological phenomenon, right? And on that view, there doesn't seem to be any kind of prescription against non-cytoplasmic things being agents, right? Agency is a dynamical phenomenon. And if that's the case, there's no, well, I don't want to say logical reason. There's no reason, there's no conceptual prescription against, say, certain kinds of machines or certain kind of AI actually being agents, right? Responding to the norms responding to the norms as norms, right? We might also want to say, no, look, we're really good at emulating agency. But emulating agency is not the same as instantiating agency, right? And that's my inclination about color perception. We're really good at emulating color perception, but we're not inclined to say that these machines that do this are perceiving colors. They're just, from the objective point of view, their behavior may be indiscernible color-wise from our color behavior, but that doesn't require us to say that they can actually take the color perspective.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And it may be that it's perfectly functional for these machines to operate in the world emulating the perception of color, but that might not be the case with respect to normative, other normative behaviors like treating each other the right way.
Right. And the same goes for things like reason and computation and things like that.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay, I think Corey has a question or comment, contribution.
Something in there. Thank you, Dennis. That was great. One quick comment. I noticed that nobody's pushed back on your basic ontological framework, which is nice. We're all just sort of debating what the consequences of it are and how to plug our favorite ethical philosophers into it. I was particularly interested in this conversation about how human level normativity fits into this, and I would have said something like, the most characteristic thing about human norms is that they're not hardwired into us biologically. We are in many ways not just norm havers, but norm makers. We don't just have goals, we construct goals.
We construct it, yeah.
And that's, I mean, we tend to, I don't know, this is probably just a psychological tendency, but we tend to hold people responsible for their norms and goals less if we think there was no chance that they could have gotten out from under them. So if you think of like a medieval peasant who's sexist, we're like, yeah, everybody was sexist in your whole society. Or, sorry, that's probably incorrect, but like, you know, to the degree that anybody had a hope of getting out from under the norms that they were sort of exposed to, we hold them responsible for them. So we are, to the extent we have the opportunity to be norm makers or goal makers rather than norm havers or goal havers. So to speak to Gillian's thing a little, I wonder if that's one of the ways that we would think seriously about the moral status of AIs, is if they, to the extent that they become self-organized in a sophisticated enough way that they are constructing their own norms. I take it all of the AI that currently exists, we tell it what its goal states are, right? We tell them, here's your goal state, here's what to optimize, here are the operators you get to use to get there. But conceivably, we could get beyond that, where the AI is deciding for itself what it wants to do with its existence. And at that point, I think you would start holding it responsible for the stuff it decides to do. Yeah. So
there's a whole bunch there. Thanks very much. So one of the worries I have about this is that it makes norms objective, but not objective enough. You know, there's like too much scope for allowing that different settings construct different norms, and then we lose our ability to blame one another, basically. Right? You know, we can't blame Frege, for instance, because it was a different time, and you know, those kinds of things, right? So that's one thing, and that's a genuine concern. Right? Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I mean, my tendency here is to say that, I mean, those norms that we really, really want to be objective are those that are the ones that have to do with either constraining other people's ability to be goal makers, mm-hmm. or facilitating them. So you want to give people the basic autonomy to be able to decide their own value structure, for example, or you want to make it such that people can construct their own goals and pursue them in their lives. So those are in the kind of like paradox of liberalism question of like, how do we create a society open enough that it can remain an open society? Those seem to be the bedrock constraints. So so here's me attempting to, sorry, more of a comment than a question, of course, but me attempting to plug my favorite ethical philosophy into this so that we can get something of what Benjamin was concerned about, which is the objective, or like maybe just the public policy apt norms out of this framework. It's those norms that have to do with preserving people's autonomy or their agency, or even enhancing their agency, something like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, right. But then again, we have to account for what the concept of agency encompasses, right? Because like our agency is fundamentally interagency, and right. So accentuating our kind of individualistic agency may not actually be promoting our agency per se, right? So yeah, that's really helpful. But again, the AI problem, not that I know about this, but this raises another worry for like what alignment is, right? Because the supposition here is that like there's something fundamentally like negotiated about our norms. I don't mean like we sit down and say, but there's something like, there's non-collusive interagent agreement about the norms, right? Which arises out of each of the participating agents, as it were, having a say, right? Now, I take it that the normal concept of alignment is we've got our norms and we want our machines to march in step, right? But if the AIs are agents, then they get a say in this too. So alignment is convergence or negotiated rather than, as it were, being assimilated to ours. Is that right, Gillian? Is that a kind of?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Where the alignment conversation needs to go is away from the idea that there's like a codex of values that we align with, but rather how do you start to participate in this complex constituting of and multifaceted constituting of and dynamic constituting of those norms. I want to try and get Jack in, and then if we've got time, we'll come to Avery.
Hello. Thank you for that. I enjoyed the talk. I think I have a straightforward clarificatory question, which was
Was it a hard one?
proceed. I mean, not necessarily. It depends on, how much is my failure to understand what you said. But so in the abstract for this talk, you said that the normatives are wholly natural. Now, I understood an argument that they are at least partly natural, or that they involve sort of naturalistic things like affordances that we could think of as natural. I didn't understand why they are wholly natural, and especially with regards to, say, goals, for example. I didn't understand what is natural about goals. We love to impose our idea of fitness on plants and animals. Mm-hmm. But that's like, is that a natural? What's not? I don't see anything that's natural about that, and it's also works even less well for humans, as some people have brought up, because we imagine that we have other ideas in our heads than fitness.
Okay, good. That's really helpful. So one of these issues is the care taken when writing an abstract. And another is what might be meant by wholly natural. So one thing that might be meant by wholly natural is not even partially non-natural. Right? And that's what I mean. Right? But another thing that might be meant by wholly natural is that a kind of pan-normativism, right? The norms are everywhere. I don't mean that. They only arise out of the fact that there are certain entities in the world that can take a perspective. So norms are norms only for agents. By wholly non-natural, I mean, we can account for how norms arise in the world through using, what we know of the natural sciences, particularly what goes on in organisms. But once we accounted for that, that's not a reductive account of norms. That's just an account of how norms arise. And then the content of the norms themselves is essentially normative.
Yeah, I think that's also somewhere that we have, it's kind of like good news for the computer scientists, because it actually says that these phenomena of normativity are subject to study and design and potentially building in these ways that we haven't thought about them. I'm going to jump to Avery to get one last question in.
Thanks so much for this really great talk. I'm just thinking about so many things, and I was thinking a little bit about Aristotle during the talk, and then you quoted, political animal, and it kind of crystallized something for me that I was thinking about during the talk, which is, Aristotle's Politics, saying that the city or the polis is the natural kind of organizing trope for,
yeah.
And so, Zoon Politikon is the natural shape of the human community. But of course, there are quite a few important exclusions in Aristotle's understanding of zoon politikon.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you would comment a little bit, because I think this would help me understand toxic normativity and toxic norms. Is the polis an affordance, or is it a goal, or is it, right, and just in the Aristotelian idea there. I can use a different word than polis, but do you see that where the question's coming from?
I think so, yeah. So to borrow another Aristotelian notion, I think of it as a way of life, a bios. So the bios of persons, organisms, is to interact in a polis. Now that doesn't preclude the polis being a goal. We could say, let's make a polis. And what was the other? Oh, an affordance. Certainly, being part of a collective affords people certain things. So it can be all of these things. But I think the way to characterize the polis in our natural history is to think of it as bios, as a way of life. And in the politics, Aristotle talks about various bioi of persons. There's the bios of a farmer, and like how they make their living. And there's the bios of even pirates, which I think is really interesting. Having been descended from pirates, I think it's really cool. That's a legitimate way of being for humans. And he doesn't mention anything about, say, hedge fund manager as a bios. So, draw your own conclusions from that. But also the living communally in. But bioi emerge at various levels of specificity. So fisherman is a pretty specific bios, but living as part of a polis is a kind of quite general feature of people's bios. Is that
Well, because I'm wondering about when an agent becomes an affordance or property or a doulos or, right? Yeah, that makes the polis and how, and I think this can also think about the question of ethics and AI and the use of agents as instruments. I don't know. I mean, it's a kind of open question, but I was trying to figure out how norms can sometimes work against certain agents. Do you see what I'm saying? And that.
Yeah. So is this like Corey's question? I mean, we have some of the goals that constitute our agency.
It's a little bit like that, yeah.
Might pull against one another. So we have these kind of individualistic goals or norms, and then we have these more communitarian goals and norms, and they might not always align. Is that the idea? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And then of course we have certain positive affordances conferred on us by the polis, but negative affordances as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's complicated. I don't know if I'm getting to the crux of the question.
But I think it sort of thinking about the toxic norms and toxic normativity, I think this whole approach invites, okay, what we need to do is try and use some of these our tools to understand, why does that emerge? What makes it stable? What destabilizes it? I think that's what I find so appealing about this approach is to take it out of the fundamentally normative view that it's about, like people being good or bad, and saying, well, got to go back behind all that structure to say, and that our scientific tools, our investigative tools can help us analyze that. I think, I'm not sure whether that was addressing it, but boy, these are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Dennis, you want one? Yes.
No, I just want to say thank you, but particularly to Avery, if you want to write to me about this, I'll see what we can do. Okay.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. And Denis, thank you for a really, really wonderful and stimulating talk. So great. And next week, another one of our research leads, Wendy Wong, and she's talking about rebooting human rights in a datafied world. So if I don't see you before then, I'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.